He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and I am pleased to say that I am definitely now on the upside of my horrific ailment that you would have heard last week's episode. My voice was just absolutely brutal. Good singing voice, but bad podcast voice, talking voice. So I'm happy to be here, though. It's going to be a good episode, and we are going to be jumping back to the 1950s. Two men out on the water spotted what they thought was an upturned boat moving upwind. Upon their approach, it suddenly flipped itself around and dived deep below the lake. Now, in the 1980s, there's a pilot that had crashed and sadly drowned in Crescent Lake. Scuba divers were dispatched to retrieve his body, but they were forced to retreat due to large groups of eels. 90s, early 2000s, the sightings continue. This episode of Cryptid Clues is going to be looking into another legendary lake monster, Cressie of Lake Crescent. For more cryptid content, be sure to check us out on our feeds. Additionally, you can find us on social media, and if you want to reach us directly, you could do so via cryptidclues@gmail.com. So, it's important to note here, there are two main Crescent Lakes. One in Olympic Park, Washington, United States, and the other one that we're going to be looking at today, located in Newfoundland. There are other smaller ones, but these are the two main ones, and I think it's easy to confuse either of them. The one you want to look for is the Crescent Lake located near the community of Roberts Arm, which is in central Newfoundland. It's a natural freshwater lake with a rich geological and ecological history to it. The lake's formation, like many of them in Newfoundland, is linked to the island's complex glacial past. So its formation and geological history, Crescent Lake was formed during the last ice age, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, when the island of Newfoundland was covered just by massive glaciers. And as these glaciers advanced and retreated, they began to carve out deep depressions into the landscape. So these depressions later on filled with water, forming lakes and other bodies of water. So Crescent Lake is a product of this glacial activity, shaped both by erosion and the melting of ice. Now, the lake sits within the broader Gander River, of the watershed, and is surrounded by rolling hills and forests typical of the central Newfoundland region. The glacial meltwater that contributed to Crescent Lake's formation also left behind deposits of sand, gravel, and silt, creating the lake's current shape and depth. Now, the crescent shape of the lake, which is the source of its name, is the result of these natural processes. So, its ecological and biological history, while the lake itself is relatively young in geological terms, having formed only within the last 10,000 years, like we said, its ecosystems have developed over a millennia. Indigenous peoples of Newfoundland, primarily the Mi'kmaq, would have inhabited the area around Crescent Lake for thousands of years, using the lake's resources, fish, freshwater, sustenance, all of that. However, the lake's aquatic life is more directly influenced by its natural formation and the species that have adapted to its environment since the glacial melt. Its size, depth, and features now, so Crescent Lake is considered a medium-sized lake. It's an estimated surface area of about 1.5 square kilometers, which is approximately 370 acres. The lake's maximum depth is around 25 meters, 82 feet. That's typical for many lakes in Newfoundland that are formed by glacial activity. It spans about 2.5 kilometers, it's 1.5 miles in length, and has, as we said, an irregular crescent-shaped shoreline contributing to its unique name. It supports a variety of aquatic life, including both fish species and plant life. Among the most notable species is the brook trout, a cold water species that thrives in the clear oxygen-rich waters of this lake. The lake is also home to several species of perch and other freshwater fish. It's a great area and has lots of opportunities for recreational fishing. The surrounding wetlands and forests, they have a diverse flora, including water lilies, other aquatic plants, as well as coniferous and deciduous trees, such as black spruce, balsam firs, and birch. It's just a very rich habitat for wildlife. And so today, now, as I mentioned, it's near Robert's Arm. This just remains a very important natural resource, and it's just a recreational hotspot for locals and tourists and visitors. It continues to support a variety of fish species, clear waters, attracting people, outdoor activities, all that kind of stuff. Lots of hiking around the area. So, with all that information on the table, let's start talking about Cressie, the local lake monster that resides here in Lake Crescent. Now, at the start of this cast, I mentioned how the 1950s is kind of where we were deep diving into, where we started. That's pretty much it with this cryptid. I could not find any reports prior to that year. However, which in my own opinion, it kind of sets up a timeline, or maybe just alternate scenarios here. The first being something happened, maybe an earthquake, unlocking a new body of water under the lake. I'm going to divert here. If you've seen the remake of Piranha, terrible movie, but the plot is interesting. We have this very popular lake during spring break. All these people. This lake succumbs to prehistoric piranhas due to another underground lake underneath the main lake opening up and connecting to the surface level lake due to an earthquake. So perhaps something existed in a very untouched ecosystem until one day a new pathway became accessible to Lake Crescent. This is bold and not factually based on anything, purely a thought, especially because it seems earthquakes aren't a concerning thing in this area. So what about the other possibility? Hoax, misidentification. We're going to get into some of that, those topics later. Considering sightings didn't start until the 1950s, perhaps nothing has ever existed here. Maybe something just kind of, again, wandered in one way or another. But I'll go one step further and say there have actually been no photographs of Cressie either. Now, this cryptid's existence and information exists solely on local oral history. Now, before I break off into sightings, it's worth mentioning that some indigenous legends do mention something, but from what I found, there wasn't a concrete verified connection that says these legends are regarding Cressie itself and Lake Crescent. Some speculate that it could be another lake. These legends, however, do mention pond devil and swimming demon. It gives me a familiar sense of the Ogopogo, actually, in the history that we have on Lake Okanagan. So one such tale, according to folklore, is of an elderly resident of Robert's Arm, known as Grandmother Anthony, and they became very startled while berry picking by a giant serpent in the lake. Now, as we mentioned at the start of the show, and is one of the earliest sightings known, is that of two men near the lake when they noticed what they assumed to be was an upturned boat until it suddenly slipped below the water's surface. Having thought it was a boat in peril, they feared maybe someone could be in danger, and they had rushed towards it. But it was when they got closer to it that they could see that it was large and slick until it basically submerged under the water. In the early spring of 1990, another local resident reported a black shape rising about 5 feet above a churning patch of water before sinking back out of sight. Shortly thereafter, in the following year on July 9th, a man named Fred Parsons and his wife submitted a report of seeing a large snake-like creature swimming in the lake. His description was that of a long, sleek body without a significantly large head, which was also laying level with the water. In the same year of 1991, and only a few months later in September, another Robert's Arm resident was returning to town when they noticed the disturbance on the lake's surface. Now, he paused and watched it when suddenly whatever the object was began to drop beneath the surface and rise back up again. His description, black, 15-foot long shape, pitching forward in a rolling motion similar to how a whale does, but there's no visible or noticeable fins. Now, it eventually sank beneath the surface and did not reappear. Now, sightings began to really pick up here afterwards. Many more in 1995, more in the early 2000s, until, however, a whole year had passed with no sightings. And this led to many people speculating that maybe the creature had actually just died, whatever it was. It was not until the year 2003 when reports started to resurface of a creature swimming, a creature which resembled a snake with a fish-like head. One very famous notable account here is that of a passenger in a passing car screaming at the driver as she looked out at the lake and saw, as she claims, Cressie on the surface. Now, she reported it to have a shiny, slick skin. Note that this was actually during the summertime, too. So they said that when the sun was hitting it, you could really see the shiny skin just really reflecting the sun back up, causing a big shine. Now, the driver eventually was watching this, too, and claimed that they could see water actually pouring out of its mouth as it was gaping. They say it was 20 feet in length and swam across the top of the lake before diving below the surface. So, as we move seasons here and we get towards the winter, residents began noticing large holes appearing in the ice, and this ice was basically a sheet that covers Crescent Lake. Now, this leads to speculation that the holes were made not by something falling into the lake, but rather by something bursting out from below. I'm not exactly sure what would prompt something to. Maybe it needs to surface for air eventually. Maybe it's not something that can exist totally underwater. I don't know. And if it's big enough, it could definitely break the ice. But it's a very interesting thought to have nonetheless. Now, to play devil's advocate, we did an episode that explored Bessie of Lake Erie. In that lake, you can find a variety of small to large-sized sturgeon. Some that can be, I say large, but I'm talking very, very, very large. And it is these very, very large sturgeon that are actually attributed often to Bessie sightings. Well, Crescent Lake has a very high population count of eels. Very, very big eels. And it's funny how these eels seem to be similar to what people are seeing in terms of like the skin and the length, and very snake-like. Now, these eels have been the number one candidate for skeptics trying to explain these Cressie sightings. And many locals, they've set up eel traps in the lake, and they exclaim that their traps are always full, practically overflowing with eels, because there's just such a booming population of them in the lake. In the 1993 article called "Have You Seen Cressie?", the author, R.A. Bragg, claims that eels do not stop growing in their lifetime, and this may be the direct cause of Cressie's size. There is one other possible explanation, however, though. If it's not eels, it possibly could be river otters. And I quote, "Swimming both underwater and at the surface where its weight can make it appear much longer, and moves in an undulating manner. In addition, multiple otters swimming in a line can give the effect of a single giant serpentine creature slithering with an up and down movement through the water." End quote. That is from investigator Joel Nichol, who definitely has a more skeptical kind of approach to this creature, but we can also attribute the classical large log theory as well. This usually applies to most, if not all, underwater cryptids, just because it's an easy explanation. It certainly doesn't get dismissed right away because, I mean, it fits. It's an absolute prime candidate for misidentification when you're dealing with underwater cryptids. Crescent Lake, as well, in particular, was used to transport many logs. It has a rich history due to the surrounding areas and paper mills. The list really does go on and on for what it could be. But without photographs and only eyewitness accounts, we are limited. But I think it's fun that we do have a variety of Essies, like Nessie and Bessie and Cressie. They're kind of like all cousins are in some weird way, but very different. You know, Loch Ness Monster is much more along the lines of that plesiosaur kind of look, and the Ogopogo, which I think is more like what Cressie is. Ogopogo, however, is more like a dragon underwater without wings, like a dragon snake, if you can picture something like that. Now, with Cressie, from the photos I could see, and we'll talk a little bit more because there's some fun tourist attractions there too with regards to Cressie. Cressie definitely seems more like a, if you've seen Beetlejuice, the sandworms, that has some kind of like resemblance to that, and maybe that's just my own personal perception on it, but I digress. Getting back to the lake itself. Now, it's beautiful, of course, but that's only coming from a guy who's just been looking at photos. If you happen to be visiting or plan to visit the area yourself, back in 1991, the town of Roberts Arm actually made a statue of Cressie at the entrance to the community. And attached to it, there's a big storyboard which has all the details from all these alleged sightings. And again, we have the same thing for our local Ogopogo here in the Okanagan. The statue is very similar, except Cressie seems to be has a bit more of a primal demeanor to its statue, but still very, very cool and on my bucket list to see in person one day. But that's where I was kind of drawing the lines of the resemblance to the sand worms or sand snakes from Beetlejuice. But again, I digress. In closing, I'm a big believer in underground highways and mountains. If you've listened to this show, you've heard me ramble many a time over about systems that allow cryptids to travel safely away from the eyes of humans and our technology. And I do think that this applies to water cryptids. We can scan and explore bodies of water, but a little earthquake could open up a new passage never before seen by humans. Or maybe technology just misses something because the tunnel is covered up with so much debris, or there's underwater sludge and seaweed or whatever that scans just can't detect beyond it. There's a lot of different possibilities, and I am definitely reaching a bit here, but I defer to my final closing case and point. We just don't know when it comes to that. So technology is not perfect, and caves can open up and close down and stuff like that. And if perhaps there was something one day, maybe it does get trapped in an underwater cave and it just ends up dying there and we never find it because the bones are buried. Like, who knows? So many different possibilities and so many things to worry about and stress about, but I'm not going to get into all of that today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Cressie from Lake Crescent. I got really excited because it's been a while since we've done something focusing on an underwater cryptid. And like I said, there's so many possibilities. We have not explored a lot of the oceans, and the same can be said for a lot of lakes too. Well, we definitely have a lot of different surveys and tests conducted on lakes. There's still lots to explore and lots to discover. And they play such a rich part in our ecosystems. So very, very important. But I digress from that. I hope you enjoyed, like I said, this week's episode of Cryptid Clues. We're going to be back next week. We have some very interesting things that are developing. Reuben had reached out to me and was like, hey, have you been checking out what's going on with the UAP congressional conferences right now? I was like, those are back on? Well, no, I have not been keeping up with that. So I'm doing some homework and I'm looking into it, and they're basically, they're talking a lot more. There's a whole bunch more of information that's being shared. And if you want to get caught up, you can tune in. Me and Reuben did a part 1 and part 2 covering the previous UAP conference that Congress had done and all the information that was shared. We basically condensed it because it's a very, very long panel. And so we went through, we selected the highlights, bullet points, and basically covered those important talking points for you in a condensed format. So we're going to be setting up the same kind of thing here and be doing that again for this because it's just there's a lot of good stuff. And of course, I'm not going political, but there's a change of government in the United States. And with that, there's always going to be a change of information brought to the public. Last time Trump had office, there was some interesting UAP information that was shared when we were dealing with the COVID situation. And we did an episode that was basically covering a lot of those documents and talking about those different talking points. So lots of interesting information. And so it makes me excited too, because, different presidents come in and they have different regulations, different things in place. Like, oh, you know what? Maybe we'll just get another piece of the puzzle and we can see where this goes with another change of government. So it's exciting. It's an exciting time to be a UAP UFO fan. And we're going to do our best to cover as much as we can. On top of that, and before I let you go here because I'm rambling, we got a little bit more Bigfoot content as well. So make sure you stay tuned over the coming weeks because we're going to have, some interesting stuff there. If you want, you can find more content at CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels. And if you wish to reach us directly, you can do so via CryptidClues@gmail.com. Until next time, everyone, thank you for tuning in to this episode. I am Taylor. Take care and stay safe.